Hello and welcome to the School Safety Free Period. I am Dr. Amy Klinger, still recording unsupervised and flying solo. Missing Amanda, but it won't be long until you'll be able to hear a more balanced version of events when we're both back here. So because I'm left unsupervised today, I'm going to start out with a little bit of a retro feel. The topic that I want to talk about today is how one thing leads to another, which brought to mind the song, which you probably have never heard of, by a band called The Fix, which came out back in November of 1983, reached number 4 on the Billboard Hot 100. So you can go back and sing that song if you know it, or maybe you've never even heard of it. But it made me think about, that's what came to mind when I was thinking about looking at a couple of the things that I want to talk about today, of how one thing leads to another, in the sense that we have all these great ideas, or we think we're anticipating what's going to happen next. And then there's always something that happens that leads to something else that we had no idea was going to be a concern. And so maybe I'm stretching a little bit here with my song analogy, but let's take a look at a couple of things that have occurred here this spring that might be worth some consideration as you think about closing out the school year and getting ready for another one. The first one occurred a few months ago. This was a situation where there was an accidental shooting in the parking lot. So you had an individual who was sitting in an elementary school parking lot, I'm assuming to pick someone up, perhaps, had a weapon and accidentally shot himself. So now you went from a typical normal elementary school dismissal to a very high profile, very chaotic situation of, is this an active shooter situation? Is this a suicide situation? What exactly is happening? We've got a weapon. It's been discharged. What do we do with the kids? Do the kids come back inside? Do we keep going with dismissal? And a whole host of different things that happened because of this one incident where, the gun accidentally discharged, and that leads us to a bunch of other things. And clearly there's a lot of anxiety around this, a lot of chaos. And that goes back to how quickly can we enact certain response capabilities. How quickly, and in this particular case, it might be a reverse evacuation. How quickly can we move those students back inside? How quickly can we gather people up and get them out of, because again, as in all response sort of procedures, what we're trying to accomplish is to move people away from the danger. Well, in this particular case, we know that there has been a gunshot, a weapon discharged outside. So the best way to move students away from that is to bring them back inside with a reverse evacuation procedure. And you can see, again, with our one thing leads to another, takes us to the next notion of, do we have adequate supervision to do so? Where are the teachers? Where are we taking them back to? Are we taking them into the gym, into one big area? Are we taking them back to their classrooms? And then we have the accountability piece of, who do we have? Where are the students? Who's here and who's not? And then the parent reunification piece of, how do we move students back now to their parents? Are we going to go to a more traditional dismissal where clearly it's now a crime scene? So that's going to be much more difficult to do. So you can see where on its face, you have this one random sort of thing that occurs that has really nothing to do with the school, but yet has this kind of ripples in a pond kind of effect on all of the decisions and the actions that the school needs to take. And the one thing they all have in common is, you're not going to make this up as you go. You're not going to be able to do this at the spur of the moment. You're going to need to have trained and or discussed or planned for, what does that procedure look like? What are we going to do when they're, and again, you're not going to be able to anticipate you shouldn't be writing a procedure for, what do we do if someone accidentally shoots themselves in the parking lot? You're writing a procedure of what happens in dismissal when we need to stop dismissal and regroup and bring the kids back in, whether that's a tornado, an intruder standing there, something, somebody accidentally shoots themselves, there's a police action happening down the street, whatever the thing is that says, nope, we cannot safely send kids home right now, then we need to have already anticipated what that's going to look like. We're going to do that reverse evacuation procedure. We're going to account for students. We're going to initiate parent unification. Now, if you've planned for those things in advance and you've trained for those things in advance, it's much easier to do because you already know. We've got a procedure, we're going to enact that one. We've got a procedure, we're going to enact that. People know what to do, not just one person, but our staff knows what to do. Our students know what to do. We have communication systems in place to push out to parents of here's what's happening, here's what you need to do, here's what's helpful, here's what's not. And those things you can't make up on the fly. And so that one thing leads to another, oftentimes really exposes a lot of potential vulnerabilities. Another one that has recently occurred that sort of shows that again was a really tragic situation at a middle school where a student shot herself in the restroom of the school. And this really speaks to a couple of things. Number one, not every shooting that occurs in a school is going to be an active shooter event. It can be other sort of discharging of a firearm, accidental, on purpose, for self-harm, all of these kind of things. And so we really see people in a lot of denial going, well, an active shooter event, that's the only thing we need to worry about. That's like the boogeyman comes from the outside, as opposed to, and this is one that one of the reasons that I bring it up is it's one that we often talk about in our training that people have just not thought about, of what does that look like and what is your response supposed to be when you have a self-inflicted shooting. It's still a shooting that's happened in your school. So you still have to secure kids. You still have to investigate. It is not going to maybe be immediately apparent what happened. Are we going to do a rapid evacuation? How quickly can we know that the threat is mitigated? And that was one of the things that occurred in this particular situation, where the kids did not know that it was an isolated incident. They believed it was an active shooter. And so they went through that whole protocol. So all of these have in common that this one incident, unexpected, unanticipated, leads to a bunch of other decisions and actions that the school needs to take. Again, securing students, accounting for students, communicating with parents, determining what you're going to do next. How do we investigate? All of those kind of things. And then even in the recovery process in this particular one, how do we go back and provide support for students who are impacted by this, especially when it's a suicide situation? And how do we provide appropriate supports and interventions for students that have been impacted by this? So you can sort of see where one thing leads to the next thing, to the next thing. We can't just go, okay, well, we responded or we did that one thing, I guess we're good. We have to really think of what each one of them leads to. This other one is a situation in Georgia where there was a fight. Somebody is recording the fight on their cell phone, and a gun falls out of one of the students, the pants of one of the students who's fighting. And so that led to a whole host of things. You went from responding to a fight in the cafeteria to now you've got a weapon on the loose, that's in the building that needs to be secured, and what that sort of thing is. There was an issue with the fact students weren't supposed to be using their cell phones, and someone was using their cell phone and was recording it. And now you've got parents involved, and they're saying, oh, we need metal detectors. And if we had a metal detector, this wouldn't have happened, which is not necessarily the case at all. And so it really ignited a lot of conversation and a lot of concern about safety measures of, how did we get to the point where this kid is casually carrying a weapon and then is now fighting, and how close were we to the step of where he actually uses that weapon and pulls it out. So it really required multiple responses by the school district. And I think that's where we often fall short in some of the discussions about planning is schools will start to look at, okay, if there's a fight in the cafeteria, what do we do? Okay, great. We have a response. We're going to do this thing. But doesn't necessarily go beyond that to the investigation. How did we get to this point? Why did this fight occur? What are we going to do differently? How did the weapon get in here? And so you really end up with a whole bunch of responses that need to be undertaken, not just the immediate reaction or response to that particular incident. So that one I think is a fairly good example of that. And then I think the last one is where one thing led to another in probably a good way, but yet kind of a heartbreaking situation for the parents. This was a situation in Tennessee where a parent was concerned about their child's behavior, eventually went into their devices and found a video where two students are wearing masks and holding pellet guns as if they're guns. They're talking about how they were wronged by people and that they wanted to attack other students. And there was a significant time period between when the video was filmed and when the parent actually found the video and saw it, about 3 months or so. Then when they do the additional investigation, they found that the students had done a lot of searching about explosives, how to make explosive devices, how to get them. And the parent made the decision, the right one, but the very difficult decision, to contact the authorities and turn in their child in order to make sure that they stopped this attack. And it's very interesting because in many ways, it's very much a textbook case. We see this in a lot of school-based attacks where you have rehearsals, you have a lot of planning and preparation behaviors up to 6 months in advance in many cases. You see a lot of interest in explosives, in trying to determine how to integrate or explosives into the attack, or how to make them and perpetrate an event using both a firearm and or an explosive device, both of which are fairly easy, unfortunately, to acquire. And so I think this one is an example of where the sort of gut of the parent led them to the difficult but I think very, very appropriate decision to monitor and see what is their kid doing, investigate, and then turn that over to authorities to have the investigation and the actions that took place. I think this is also a good example of where you are being proactive. Sometimes the one thing leads to another, starts with an incident. Other times, the one thing leads to another with a really good outcome is because we were proactively starting to pay attention, investigate, ask questions, listen to what's happening, take the cues that are around us and do something with them. And almost always one thing will lead to another. You may not be stopping a potentially catastrophic event like this one, but you definitely are getting that student the supports and interventions that they need much sooner. When we look at that continuum of planning and preparation behaviors that leads to the tragic implementation, the sooner that we can intervene, that we can pick up on what's happening and provide support and intervention, it's much more likely that we are going to prevent tragedies. And this parent potentially saved their child's life, as well as potentially the life of other students. So this one is a very heartfelt but positive example of one thing leading to another. So I think the takeaway for today is really looking at our planning behaviors as being multiple steps. We're always going to have a response. we're always going to need to think about communication. We're always going to need to think about the role of parents, of how do we account for students? How do we get parents involved? How do we get parents notified? How do we have parents come back to pick up their children? So there's these multiple different things. It's not just, do we have a tip line? Okay, great. We've got a tip line so someone can tell us. No, it's really looking at it much more from a much more comprehensive standpoint of there are going to be multiple steps and multiple touch points in any of these kind of incidents or preventative behaviors that we're going to be working on. At our website, we always love to provide you with resources and information that you can use. Our School Safety 101 course is an online on-demand course that touches on many, many, many of the things that we talk about here in the free period, and really is a good foundational way to start building your capacity in terms of school safety, both no matter what your role is, whether you're a school leader, a school, an educator, a school staff member, a parent. All of us have a role to play in keeping our kids safe. So we love to work with you on that. Please stay in touch. Check out our website at www.eschoolsafety.org. And thanks again for joining.